The Miseducation of Cameron Post was released in July 2018 and is written and directed by Desiree Agavan. The film is based on a book which shows the lives of teenagers who have been sent to the gay conversion camp God's Promise, based in 1993, where the belief is that God doesn't make mistakes, what's wrong with you is your fault and it's yours to fix. The teenagers are sent here to be cured under the supervision of the counsellors. As the main character, Cameron, points out in the film, as she's resisting and rebels against this system, the camp is essentially programming people to hate themselves. And the film has been nominated for several awards and won also. The composer Julian Vass's typical style of composition consists of a generally electronic soundtrack. His instrumentation largely consists of a mixture of glockenspiel and xylophones with a distorted effect alongside electronic keyboard and occasionally hand drum. The combination of these instruments gives an almost otherworldly and ethereal feeling to the atmosphere he creates. The electronic sound and levels of texturizing gives almost a retro video game feeling, perhaps hinting to remind the audience of their childhood through a nostalgic effect with his playful meshes of instrumentation. He is heavily influenced by the video game composer Yasunori Mitsuda, which often he pays tribute to in his compositions. His writing perhaps also brings out the fact that these teenagers in the camp are really just innocent children put into a very wrong situation, with some of his writing sounding like a lullaby almost. However, the scene that I'm analysing has a very different feel to his typical style of writing, not only in this film but his other films as a whole, which I think is what makes it so memorable. At the beginning of each group meeting they have at this camp, they all say a prayer thanking God for allowing them to have this experience and for helping them to change their lives. And so in this scene, the counsellor first speaks to the character Mark, who had previously been told that he would be going home in a few weeks, deemed fit to leave and suitably converted. However, before this meeting, he received a letter from his father denying him the chance to return home, saying that the fact that he's still very feminine is a weakness and that would bring shame upon his family. When asked how this made him feel, instead of answering the question, he chose to read his father's favourite passage from the Bible. The camera shots in this scene, and actually most of the film, linger on slightly longer than you'd expect, almost uncomfortably at times, which I think enhances the realism and feeling this intensity when there are close-ups of the teenagers' faces. Because of this, we're then more engaged, feeling their emotions from their point of view, not knowing what will happen next or what will be said. So at the beginning of this scene had been written without scoring, perhaps to draw attention to the contrast of the unexpected event that will follow. So really the music here is used to emphasise the key moments of the scene. At the start, when he recites the passage, he speaks calmly and then begins to cry and stand up, stutter, and his speech and actions become more theatrical and almost disturbing. And this is when the music starts at 1 hour 8 minutes and 22 seconds, which really enhances the audience's emotions and add to the theatrics. It also reinforces the irony of the reading when he says, "When I am weak, then am I strong." The absence of this otherworldly feeling with silence and use of pure solo strings brings the audience back to reality as the situation becomes very real in Mark's breakdown, evoking this feeling to the audience with a dark minor key. In this scene, he primarily uses cello and violin briefly towards the end. The cello is often considered an instrument that's closest in range and tone to that of a human voice. This could perhaps be representing Mark's struggle in this distressing breakdown that he's having. The audience then feel his emotion on a much deeper level than if the scene were in complete silence. Lipscomb writes that music has the potential to evoke emotion in a scene that would, in its absence, be perceived as neutral. The use of these pure strings without electronics brings our attention to the passage from the Bible that Mark reads, using instrumentation that would be perhaps heard in church services and reminiscent of Bach, still giving an otherworldly feeling, but one in stark contrast to the rest of the film, almost taking us back in time hundreds of years when homosexuality was illegal, ironically showing the ridiculousness of the fact that these conversion camps still existed in the 90s and still do now. As Prendergast writes, music can create a more convincing atmosphere of time and place. By using this stylistic integration of classical instruments, when Mark is reading from the Bible, this creates a very specific atmosphere that Vass wanted to achieve. The music brings us closer to the character, feeling empathy for Mark on a much deeper level. The audience can then better relate and connect to the character's emotions, even if they themselves haven't gone through this exact same situation. The central theme in this scene is primarily loneliness and isolation, which is reflected by the use of the solo instrument. And the function of the music in this particular scene is really to control the audience's perception of what they're meant to be feeling and seeing. Vass plays around with diegetic and non-diegetic sound interspersed within the film. In earlier scenes, he often uses the optimistic and light-hearted music from a fitness video that the teenagers exercise to in their spare time, which gradually becomes non-diegetic music as the scene switches to another, allowing this seamless continuity between scenes. However, in this chosen scene, the music is non-diegetic and is intended to be played on top of the action that's happening rather than existing within this world that the characters are in to hear it themselves. Lipscomb points out that the musical sound provides a cue for the listener, evoking perhaps discomfort, and Vass uses the technique known as Mickey Mousing in this scene when he sinks the music so abruptly as Mark theatrically drops the Bible he had read from onto the floor in the middle of the room. So by doing so, the music here is directly underpinning the action and is used as a structural device. This could also perhaps reflect a brief sense of resolution when the book is down on the floor and the uneasy ostinato passage subsides. Mickey Mousing is a technique that's often used to soften confrontational scenes, giving a sense of relief almost. As the counsellor says, there is no need for theatrics at 1 hour, 8 minutes and 50 seconds. We then hope that Mark would calm down and the scene would begin to settle. However, after this, he then interrupts the counsellor and continues to read the passage even more theatrically through tears. The overuse of this technique could become perhaps too comical for such a scene like this and almost annoying in some cases, yet Vass's perfect timing and sparing use of this technique when the counsellor, for example, holds Mark to the floor with her foot at 1 hour, 9 minutes and 32 seconds, only intensifies our emotion and engagement in the scene further as the audience. Perfect syncing with narrative action masks its presence so we can create an emotional effect on this semi-conscious level without interrupting the credibility of the narrative on a conscious level. So the function of this technique is really to clarify the action, especially when there's no speech, as in some parts of this scene. As Mark's breakdown begins to worsen the ostinato of the cello at 1 hour 9 minutes, begins to increase in tempo. This enhances the underlying emotion of the scene. As Lipscomb writes, music can readily convey pace by establishing patterns in the use of music, sound effects, and silences, and then manipulating these established patterns to increase tension. A film can be made to feel like it's speeding up or slowing down. For example, in this scene with gradual elimination of silence, as Vass does, and the ambient shift between scenes becomes more extreme, this creates the impression of a quickening pace. This short scene is intensely scored in stark contrast to the rest of the film, which is actually mostly silent, where the teenagers are often playing, joking lightheartedly about their situation, with a sense of optimism that their lives will continue after leaving the camp, which is also reflected in the nostalgic and light-hearted feel of the score previously. This, going back to the ostinato effect on the cello, gives the audience a sense of dread and unpredictability, unable to anticipate what would happen next. This whole scene really shows the absurdities of the conversion camps and how damaging they were and still are for a child's mental health, leaving us with an unsettled feeling at the end of the film. Another technique that Vass uses is the non-vibrato strings at 1 hour 9 minutes and 45 seconds in particular. This also gives a sense of menace and an unsettled feeling. As Prendergast writes, the music is used to express unspoken thoughts and unseen implications that underlie the drama. The cello and violin gradually play sub pont, so nearer to the bridge, perhaps to represent the pain that Mark's feeling and to increase this tension. This adds the storytelling on a much deeper level than just visuals. This minor sonority evokes an intense sense of unease, almost painful to listen to, as well as the sul pont becomes more prevalent in the scoring. This scratchy sound reflects perhaps Mark's pain as the audience. We feel threatened that something dreadful is about to happen. And also this seamless change from cello in the lower register to that of the violin is also a technique which gives the effect of increased tension, as the strings themselves are shorter and more taut than the violin. This sul pont passage that we have in the violin towards the end of the scene, where Cameron is about to walk into the bathroom, increases the tension that we feel emotionally because it's more uncomfortable to listen to as the audience. So as the sul pont intensifies, we move closer to the bridge, and also the tempo increases in this passage as well, before abruptly stopping to the climax of the scene where the counsellor's foot has brought Mark to the ground. The use of solo cello in a minor key evokes a sense of sorrow before increasing in tempo with this fast-paced tremolo followed by ostinato string crossing passage. This melody and its pulsating rhythm is quite simple, perhaps to represent the children in the camp, or even this feeling of weakness that Mark has as he recites the passage, saying, "When I am weak, then am I strong." Throughout the film, Vass is very aware of the powerful effect that silence has on the audience, as silence really can be deafening. As Claudia Gorman notes, that some pictures are so realistic that music would only hurt and interfere, so sometimes it's just not necessary. The silence when he drops the book, for example, leaves the audience not knowing what will happen next. For example, would the monologue continue down a much darker path, or would he end there? So we're left with this anticipation. The music in this scene finishes again with a minor harmony on an unresolved fifth, leaving the sense we're wondering what has happened to Mark as we see the blood on the floor. Moving on to the next scene the following day in complete silence, again bringing us, as the audience, back to reality. Lipscomb writes that without dialogue or sound effects, the music as the sole component, the isolated music at this point of the narrative effectively serves the important structural function of letting the audience know that this is the culmination of the tragic or sad part of the film that's about to occur, so reinforcing this intended tone that Vass wanted. The contrast of instrumentation and scoring in this scene to the rest of the film, I think, is what makes this scene particularly striking and thought-provoking to the audience. So just as a short example of when the music is underpinning the action, when we are at the scene where Cameron wakes up in the middle of the night after she's thinks she's heard something in the bathroom, so she goes to see what it is. We have this ostinato passage on the cello with the spreading of the chords, and it starts off quite slowly and then increases in tempo and also in dissonance, which is enhancing what we're hearing on the screen, adding to the tension. And then after this, Mark drops the book on the floor and we have this Mickey Mousing effect. This whole scene goes back and forth between the morning of the group meeting where Mark's breakdown is happening at the time, to that same evening where only the main character Cameron is present. In the montage of scenes like this, as Prendergast writes, music can serve an almost indispensable function. The continuity of music here between shots can hold the montage together with one underlying musical idea, essentially, which is the solo cello or violins ostinato passage. The music here provides this underpinning for this theatrical build-up in the scene, both as Mark becomes more and more distraught as he's reading the passage, and also when Cameron wakes up and is walking down this corridor in the middle of the night, getting closer and closer to Mark's bathroom where she had suspected that something had happened. So the music that Vass uses here then seamlessly rounds off the montage with a sense of finality. Through the compositional techniques Vass uses here, this further enhances the overall retention of the film and changes and reinforces the interpretation that Vass and the directors wanted to portray.